England, 3 things on its 50. The country is still on its knees. The Black Death has swept through more than a third of the population in less than 2 years. Entire villages erased from the map, fields left to rot, churches without priests to bury the dead, the smell of a civilization breaking under its own weight. And it was in that vacuum of authority, of order, of hope, that they appeared. Men trained to kill, without a lord, without loyalty, without limit. The medieval mercenaries of 14th century England were not ordinary criminals. They were elite soldiers, veterans of Edward III's brutal campaigns in France, men who could handle a sword or draw a warbow better than most knights, who came home to find a broken country and no wages waiting. The war had paused, the violence had not. This is their story, who they were, how they lived, how they operated, what made them so feared and so impossible to stop, and what happened when the Crown itself looked these men in the eye and blinked. Stay with us until the very end, because the most disturbing part of this story isn't the violence. It's what these men reveal about the world that built them and then abandoned them. A village in the English countryside, late winter, 1349. The priest is gone, so is the blacksmith. So is the woman who sold bread by the church gate every Thursday morning without fail for 30 years. Half the names in the parish register now have a single line drawn through them, the mark a scribe made when there was no one left to mourn the dead properly. The Black Death arrived in England in the summer of 1348, carried by fleas on rats aboard trading ships landing at ports like Weymouth and Bristol. It moved fast, faster than any army, faster than any rumor. By the time it had run its course, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire English population was dead. Modern historians estimate the toll at 2 to 2.5 million people. In a country of roughly 5 million, that number doesn't fit inside the mind easily. It has to be felt. Fields rotted unharvested. Livestock wandered without owners. The price of labor collapsed upward. Suddenly there weren't enough hands-on to work the land, and the surviving peasants knew it. For the first time in living memory, ordinary men had leverage. The rigid feudal pyramid, king above all, then lords, then knights, then serfs with no choice and no exit, was cracking from the inside. And then the soldiers came home. Edward III had been fighting in France since 1337, in what history would eventually name the 100 Years' War. At Crécy in 1346, English longbowmen had torn apart the French cavalry in one of the most lopsided victories the medieval age had ever produced. At Calais, Edward had starved an entire city into surrender. These were men forged in some of the most brutal warfare Europe had seen in a century. When the campaigns paused and the armies were demobilized, thousands of soldiers returned to England. Many came back to find their villages half empty, their families gone, their land repossessed or simply abandoned. There was no compensation waiting, no pension, no plan. A knight, even a minor one, might find a new lord to serve. But an archer, a foot soldier, a man-at-arms without a patron, he had a weapon, a set of skills honed by years of professional violence and nothing else. Some found work, most struggled, and a number of them made a calculation that, in the wreckage of post-plague England, must have felt almost rational. The skills the Crown had spent years teaching them. How to raid, how to intimidate, how to take what they needed from the land and from the people on it. Those skills worked just as well at home as they had in France. The mercenary crisis in England was not born from evil. It was born from abandonment. They didn't operate alone. That's the first thing that surprises people. The image of the medieval outlaw as a lone wanderer, ragged, desperate, striking at random, doesn't match what the historical record shows. The men who terrorized English roads and villages in the 1350s were organized. They had structures, hierarchies, rules, even. They called themselves companies or bands, sometimes retinues, borrowing the language of legitimate military service. And in many ways, that's exactly what they were. Military units that had simply changed their employer. They no longer answered to a lord or a king. They answered to whoever led them and they followed that leader for one reason alone: profit. A typical band might range from 15 to 50 men. At its head was usually a veteran, someone who had commanded men in France, who understood logistics, who knew how to read terrain and exploit it. These leaders weren't chosen by title or birth. They were chosen by reputation, by the particular kind of authority that comes from being the most dangerous man in a room and making sure everyone in the room knows it. Below the leader, the group was organized by function. Core fighters, men who had served as archers or men-at-arms, some still wearing pieces of their military kit, a padded gamson, a battered iron helmet, a sword that had tasted real battle. They slept on the ground, in barns, under bridges, in the ruins of plague-emptied farmhouses. There were also lookouts and scouts, who moved ahead of the group to assess targets before the main body arrived. And there were fixers, men who handled the negotiation side of extortion. Men who could speak to a frightened merchant or a village elder in terms that sounded, just barely, like a business transaction. Because that's what it often was. A company would arrive at the edge of a settlement and offer, in so many words, a choice. Pay, and we pass through without incident. Don't pay, and we don't pass through at all. We stay. This practice, known on the continent as patis, a form of enforced protection payment, was imported directly from the French campaigns. English and other armies had used it systematically against French civilian populations for years. The soldiers who brought it back to England weren't inventing something new. They were applying a technique they had been taught and paid to use on foreign soil. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers. The very tactics that Edward III had deployed against French peasants were now being used against English peasants by Edward's own veterans. What did these men think of themselves? A handful of legal depositions survive from the period. Transcripts of captured men questioned before judges. The tone in these documents is rarely remorseful. More often, it is matter of fact. One man, tried in 1353 for a series of robberies along a road in the Midlands, reportedly told the court that he had done what soldiers do. The judge, according to the clerk's notes, had no immediate answer to that. The road between two market towns in central England, spring 1352. A wool merchant traveling with 2 servants and a cart loaded with bales of fleece. The journey should take 3 days. He never arrived. Records from this period are fragmentary, but they tell a consistent story. The roads of mid-14th century England, already dangerous by the standards of any era, became something closer to a gauntlet. Merchants reduced their travel. Pilgrims moved in larger groups. Monasteries began keeping careful records of who passed through their gates, a form of communal surveillance born from communal fear. The targets were chosen carefully. Wool merchants were prize catches. Wool was England's most valuable export, easily converted to cash or traded for supplies. Traveling clergy, often carrying church revenues between houses, were targeted with a frequency that scandalized contemporary chroniclers. Minor noblemen moving between estates, far from their own garrison of retainers, were vulnerable in ways that would have seemed unthinkable a generation earlier. The tactics were refined. A band rarely attacked in the open. They preferred choke points, narrow bridges, forested roads, river crossings where a cart couldn't maneuver and a rider couldn't gallop. They used intelligence. Someone in a nearby village, paid or coerced, who would pass word about an upcoming shipment or a traveler of means. They struck fast, and then they vanished back into the landscape before any organized response could arrive. When violence did occur, it was deliberate and calibrated. Killing a merchant solved nothing. Dead men couldn't pay ransom, and murder created legal consequences that a simple robbery did not. Wounding him or harming one of his servants badly enough to make the point clear was often more effective. Fear was the product these men were selling, but not always. There are documented cases of killings. Men who resisted too hard, servants who fought back, travelers who were simply in the wrong place during a night when the company had grown hungry or desperate or drunk. The coroners rose from counties like Leicestershire and Northamptonshire in this period show a marked increase in homicides attributed to unknown men described as armed and traveling in groups. Villages along major roads suffered a particular kind of terror. A company would sometimes move into a settlement and simply stay, eating the food, occupying the houses, demanding payment for the privilege of their continued restraint. Days could pass before they moved on, and in the meantime, the village elder had to calculate carefully how much resistance the community could absorb and how much submission it could afford. Some villages paid, some resisted and paid a far worse price. The sheriffs were supposed to respond. In theory, the sheriff of each county commanded the power to raise the hue and cry, a legal obligation for all able-bodied men to join the pursuit of criminals. In practice, the hue and cry had been designed for ordinary criminals, not for organized groups of trained soldiers who knew how to set an ambush. Men who were not afraid of a pursuing mob because they had faced actual armies. The system was confronting something it had never been built to handle. Edward III was not a king who tolerated disorder. He had built his entire reputation on control of his armies, his court, his kingdom's image at home and abroad. The spectacle of his own veterans terrorizing English roads was not merely a legal problem. It was a political embarrassment. And it was getting worse every season. His first response was legislative. In 1349, the royal government issued the Ordinance of Laborers, an attempt to freeze wages and control the movement of workers in the chaos left by the plague. 2 years later, the Statute of Laborers reinforced it. These measures were aimed partly at economic stabilization, but they also targeted the growing class of mobile, masterless men, former soldiers among them, who moved through the countryside outside of any traditional feudal structure. The laws did not work. They couldn't work, for a reason that should have been obvious. The men they were targeting had no stake in legal compliance. A feudal serf had land, a community, a lord who might protect him in exchange for loyalty. A masterless soldier had none of those things. Threatening him with legal penalties assumed he had something to lose. Many of them didn't. The Crown then turned to the judicial apparatus itself. Commissions of the peace, bodies of local landowners empowered to investigate and try crimes, were strengthened and expanded throughout the 1350s. By 1361, the Office of Justice of the Peace would be formally established, creating a permanent local judiciary. Historians have noted that the chaotic decade of the 1350s was one of the direct pressures that forced this institutional reform into existence. But in the short term, the justices faced the same problem as the sheriffs. Information was unreliable. Witnesses were terrified. Juries drawn from the same communities living under the shadow of armed bands were reluctant to convict men who might return for revenge the moment the court adjourned. There were arrests. There were trials. Some men were hanged. But the companies adapted, moving between counties, changing their composition, dissolving and reforming under new leadership the moment pressure mounted in any particular area. Edward tried a different approach entirely: re-employment. New campaigns in France offered a way to absorb surplus soldiers back into military service, giving them wages, structure, and a legitimate target for their violence. The resumption of the 100 Years' War in the late 1350s did pull some of the most dangerous men back across the Channel. Historians have argued that this was, in some ways, a deliberate strategy. Export the violence, buy domestic peace. It worked, partially. Some of the most lethal men left England for France, where they would go on to form the notorious free companies that would terrorize the French countryside for decades. The problem wasn't solved. It was transferred, and for those who remained, England in the late 1350s was still a landscape where the rule of law was negotiated, not guaranteed. Where a road could be safe 1 week and lethal the next, where the distance between order and chaos was measured not in miles, but in how close the nearest armed company happened to be. By the 1360s, the worst of it had passed. Not because the Crown had solved the problem, but because the problem had slowly changed shape. Some mercenaries had returned to France. Others had aged out of violence, settling into the margins of rural communities, becoming the kind of men people whispered about rather than feared directly. A few had found legitimate work, as guards, as minor officials, as men whose dangerous past made them useful to lords who needed enforcers of a more respectable variety. But the decade had left marks that didn't fade. The legal system of England had been fundamentally reshaped by the pressure of this period. The justice of the peace, that cornerstone of English local governance that would endure for centuries, was born partly in response to the breakdown of the 1350s. The Statute of Labourers, however ineffective, established a precedent for royal intervention in the labour market that would echo through English law for generations. And then there was something else, something harder to legislate away. The mercenaries had exposed a fault line in the medieval world's most cherished ideal, the knight as protector. The entire justification for the military class, for the enormous privileges that knights and men at arms enjoyed, the land, the title, the social standing, rested on a single premise. Their violence served order. They fought so that others didn't have to. They protected the weak. What the 1350s demonstrated was that this had always been a transaction, not a principle. Remove the payment, remove the structure, remove the lord and the cause, and the trained killer didn't become a protector. He became a predator. Geoffrey Chaucer, writing his Canterbury Tales in the 1380s, included in among his pilgrims a knight described as having fought in some of the most distant and morally ambiguous campaigns in Europe. Scholars have debated for generations whether Chaucer's knight is the idealized figure he appears to be on the surface, or a quietly devastating portrait of a man whose career looks, on closer inspections, uncomfortably like that of a mercenary. A man who fought wherever there was money, for whoever was paying, and called it honor. The ambiguity was the point. The men who terrorized English roads in 1350, who extorted villages and ambushed merchants, and made sheriffs look helpless, were not anomalies of history. They were the system, stripped of its pretense, warriors without wars, killers without causes, men whom society had built, trained, deployed across a foreign country, and then refused to take responsibility for when they came home. The Black Death had killed the bodies. The mercenaries revealed something harder to bury, that the social order depended not on justice, but on everyone having just enough to lose. When men lose that, when they come home to empty villages, and empty pockets and a kingdom that has no use for them, the violence doesn't disappear. It just stops serving the king, an empty road, wind moving through a break in the hedgerow, and somewhere, beyond the tree line, the faint clink of iron moving through the dark. England, 1350. The plague was almost over. The danger was not.